I titled this talk, Serving God Where You Are. I've got a Bible, don't worry, it's not going to be a long, heavy session. I'll tell you a little bit about my background and the story of how God's worked in my life. But that phrase, serving God where you are, is not my phrase. I've nicked it. It came from one of the first talks that I heard at St Joseph's Benwell, where myself and Jonathan and a few others here worship. I ended up there back in the summer of 2016, and I picked up on that phrase because at that point in my life I wasn't really sure what God was doing, and I wasn't sure where I was meant to be serving Him. 3 years prior to that, we'd left a church, a family that we really loved, which I'd been working at for several years, and I'd enjoyed being there, grown massively. We left friends, we moved house, not that far, but into a new place. And now, just 3 years later, we'd come off the back of having to make a really difficult decision to close the church that we're involved in. I was looking for a new job. We needed a new church family, we needed a new house, and we sat there, I sat on that pew thinking, how did we get here? This wasn't exactly what I had planned, and it isn't what I thought God had planned for us either. I'll come back to that phrase a little bit later on, but let me give you a bit of backstory, a bit of my kind of early life. My father's from Newcastle, my children are all born in Newcastle, so they're Geordies. I grew up in York, so I'm a southerner. Depends where you are, so how you interpret that. I grew up in a pretty typical kind of house, typical kind of upbringing, with the exception that my parents were both strong Christians. And so Jesus, the Bible, church were something that was just a normal part of life for me. In fact, they were really the centre of life and how we organised ourselves as a family. I knew that other people didn't believe the same things that we did and didn't organise their lives in the way that we did or prioritise the things that we did. And I guess if you'd have asked me at 10 or 11 if I was a Christian, I'd have said yes. And I'd have been able to give you a pretty good explanation for what that meant. We went to a pretty serious church, and I went through pretty serious membership classes. I could have talked to you about substitutionary atonement from fairly early age. That might put you off. But I would have said that I was a Christian, and I'd have been able to kind of explain what that meant, and on paper at least it looked like I was, but I would describe my faith at that point as being a bit like being a really strong key member of a political party. I'll let you insert which political party works for you, but it was how I saw the world, but in a lot of ways it mainly stayed in my head. It made sense to me that there was a God. And of all the gods, the Christian one seemed to be one of the more reasonable ones. As for church, well, I liked the people. They were kind. They weren't stupid. I knew that. And church was great, wasn't it? Especially when it involved food. The service, well, that was painfully dull to me, but something you had to get through. And the people made it okay. In fact, I can remember one Sunday afternoon, my father would occasionally go and preach in other churches around Yorkshire, and we were coming home from one of those occasions in the afternoon, and a car pulled out in front of us, and we swerved, avoided the car, but didn't avoid the dry stone wall on the side of the road, and wrote off the car. And I can remember guiltily feeling quite happy that we weren't going to have to go to the evening service. That all changed for me around the age of 14, and there were very few young people in the church that I grew up in, so my parents started sending me on camps, just I think to meet a few more Christians who are my age. So I started going to these camps in North Wales, and the message that I had heard probably hundreds, if not thousands of times before about Jesus and about what he'd done for me on the cross, and how I needed to make a decision about that for myself. Well, I'd heard it hundreds of times before, but this time I was listening, and I became a Christian, wrestled with that for a while, kind of thought, oh, maybe this just happened because I was in a tent away from everything. It was a bit of, a bit too emotional, was that it? But things started to change. Those church services, which I'd found painfully dull and made my way through counting the bolts on the ceiling, were entirely different now. The worldview that I had inherited from my parents was now my personal faith, and the God who I'd heard so much about was now somebody that I knew. So what next after that? Well, I don't know if this has been your experience or not. Maybe you've had a very clear sense of what God wanted you to do and where you were meant to be in life from a really young age, and you've seen that plan unfold in stages, really progressively and really regularly. It's not really been the case for me. I feel like God has dragged me along and just put the next step in front of me when it was time to step on it, without me always understanding what that might be. Had a good friend, best Christian friend growing up. His best friend from school became a Christian in a really remarkable transformation from being someone who was an absolutely avowed atheist to someone who started trusting in Jesus and then decided that if it was true, it was the most important thing in the world. He started speaking in the open air in the middle of York City Centre, asked me to come along. Couldn't think of a good enough reason to say no. So that was my introduction to sharing my faith. After that, got to the end of school, wasn't sure what was next, so like many people, took a year out, shelf-stacked for a while, and then thought, well, what else should I do? There was a couple in our church who'd been missionaries and just come back. They said, well, have you ever thought about going to Japan and being a short-term missionary? So I said, yeah, why not? I'll do that for a bit. I went to university up here in Newcastle. That's how I came back to my roots in the northeast. By the end of that, again, I wasn't sure what was next. And so somebody said, well, do you want to do a job helping Christian students grow in their faith and share it with their non-Christian flatmates? I said, yes. When I asked the girl who had moved me into university halls and run the Bible study in them to marry me, well, this time she said yes. So it seemed, although I wasn't very clear at each stage what was next and how I was meant to serve God, that he seemed to know what he was doing, and I should just follow in his path and should just keep saying yes. The first time I remember that being challenged, though, was just after I'd got engaged to my wife, Carly. We were going to two different churches at that time. She attended Jesmond Parish Church, that some of you will be familiar with. I went to a little evangelical independent church. I couldn't cope with going to Jesmond, it was too big. Sometimes the people wore robes there. I've never seen that before, couldn't do it. She described my church as quaint. I think she was being charitable at that point. So we had this decision to make. Going to two churches didn't make sense. We needed to go to one, but which one should we choose? And joking aside, there were really good reasons to go to either of those churches, places where we could serve, places where we could grow. But I remember feeling pretty paralysed and thinking, this is my responsibility now to try and help us think this through, to lead us, to try and make a decision. And I couldn't decide. We talked about it and we wrote pros and cons lists and prayed about it, but there didn't seem to be a clear answer one way or the other. And that's when church planting came into our lives. I think in kind of little bio and introductory, I said that I've been involved in church planting. I'm up to 3 now. Not quite sure when a church plant isn't a church plant anymore. I'm going to say 10 years. It's not a church plant anymore. Church plant, if you're not familiar with that term, is just the establishing of a new church, of a new congregation. Sometimes that's done with an existing church that sponsors it. Sometimes it's a group of people coming together from across churches. But the first one that we were involved in was Holy Trinity Gateshead. So we heard about this church that was forming somewhere south of the river, which was somewhere we'd never heard of before, completely unfamiliar with. But we felt that God was leading us to the next step, so we joined a prayer meeting that was established to think about starting that church. And so when it launched in early 2008, we were part of the kind of founding group of people. Things moved pretty quickly after that for us. That summer we got married, and I joined the church staff in the autumn. Just to give you an insight into what church planting is like, when Jonathan Pryke, who I think has spoken here before, interviewed me for the role, I asked what the job description was, and he said, well, really it's anything from cleaning the toilets to preaching, and that proved to be accurate. Did all those things and everything in between. Remember one of the first jobs that I did starting was is a wonderful story which I'll tell you more about another time if people are interested in how the church sort of inherited a plot of land and the plans for a building and a little bit of money as well, which was a great start and a great provision from God. One of the problems was, though, church didn't really look like a church. Everybody seemed to think it was a doctor's surgery or a community centre. So we had the idea of putting a sign up, and we were going to have an illuminated cross on the top. So one of my first tasks was getting planning permission and working out some of the ways that sign was going to stay up and not fall down. Is that me? Let's carry on. So that was my first introduction to church planting. After what must have been hundreds of trips back and forth across the Tyne, we eventually moved house and found a place in Gateshead to be closer to church. But it wouldn't be for long, because the next step in God's plan was fast approaching. Was offered the opportunity to move on from HTG, Trinity Gateshead, and to move back north of the river again onto safe ground and into the west end of Newcastle to start another new church. This time with a bit less background, a bit less backing. There'd been 8 people who got together and started meeting in somebody's living room. A few more had joined by the time that we did. But I was back in the west end of Newcastle, which I'd spent my childhood visiting, and back again in a different role, but feeling like God had once again put another kind of step in front of me. What we lacked in number and probably human resources, I think we made up for in a willingness to work. My kids, who were, one of them wasn't around then, and were fairly young at the time, grew up moving and stacking chairs and helping set up the PA equipment and all the other things that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with that go along with running churches. All that had to be done. It was hard work at times, but there was a sense of real dependence on God and a real sense of being a church family who really knew each other, who worked alongside each other, and who rejoiced with each other when things were going well, and who grieved with each other when things were going less well. 3 years later, though, that sadly changed. Although from very small beginnings the church had grown and we'd attracted more people to join us, and things were in some ways going pretty sustainably, we hadn't really done what we set out to do, which was to make a mark in the local community. Lots of the people who joined us were coming from afar, but we're having less success in sharing the gospel with the local community, which is what we wanted to do, really. And so after that, as I came to the end of my sort of initial 3-year role, a pretty difficult decision was made to close the plan and to refold it back in to the mother church. And so that brings us back to that phrase, serve God where you are. I've been lots of different places over the previous 20 years, but always feeling like God was leading me along. That phrase, serve God where you are, came from a talk on Jonah, chapter 1. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, might be familiar with the story of Jonah. Jonah hears God runs in the opposite direction, gets on a boat, gets thrown into the sea, swallowed by a fish, vomited up by a fish, goes and tells the people about God. They respond. Jonah hates it. God's merciful. It's a pretty wild story, but one bit of the story which I wasn't familiar with up to that point is actually that's not the only time you hear about Jonah. He pops up in one other place prior to the story of Jonah, the book of Jonah, in 2 Kings chapter 14. Just in one verse, Jonah is listed there in verse 25 as a prophet, and as a good one. Well, as a prophet who is used by God to speak to his people and to bless them. He's instrumental in a really positive period in Israel's history, in a time when God uses him to redeem part of the land there, to restore part of Israel's borders. I don't know about you, but I had never really thought about Jonah pre-fish. Never imagined that he had a life, or still less a ministry, in which God had used him greatly. But then God asked him to do something else, to go somewhere he really wasn't expecting and probably didn't really want to go, somewhere where he didn't understand where God was leading him to. And as I sat in church that day, I related to Jonah. Up to that point, I thought, although I didn't always have a clear plan for where I was heading, I was very confident that God did, and that he'd guide my steps and provide the next step along the path or the next brick in the wall. But now I couldn't really see where he was taking me, and I wasn't sure how I was meant to serve him either. Jonah faced a choice when God spoke to him and told him to go and tell people in Nineveh about him. Be obedient to God and go where he didn't want to, even though he couldn't understand why God would want to take him there. Or he could do what he actually did, close his ears, run in the opposite direction, and get shipped to anywhere except Nineveh. And I think that likewise, wherever we find ourselves, we get to choose whether we listen to God and what he'd have us do, or whether we decide to run in the opposite direction. It's not always as dramatic or obvious as Jonah's life. More often it's in the small things, in the everyday decisions, that we have to decide whether we're going to listen to God or not. God's given us things to do now. It's not necessarily a grand, big next step. Things aren't always completely clear. But we always have the option to serve God now, where we are, with the things and with the gifts and with the people and with the opportunities that he's given us now. For me, that meant for the first time getting a secular job. I'm now a civil servant. I do something called internal auditing. That's normally where the conversation ends. I say to people, I say, what do you do? I'm an internal auditor. And they look a bit blank and they go, well, how did you get into that? And I said, well, actually, since I was a young boy, it's what I've always really risk and governance. I've just been dreaming about those things. It tends to be a career that people fall into from other places. And really, the job is to act as a kind of critical ear and to help people, give them confidence about projects that they're doing, and try and identify if there are problems earlier rather than later. But that was all new for me. Before, it was very obvious to me how my faith and my job related, because I was working in full-time ministry. My job involved getting to my desk, opening up my Bible, trying to work out what I had to say, writing a talk, writing a Bible study. But now I had to think, well, what does it mean when I step into a meeting? What does it mean when I get that email that's ever so slightly passive-aggressive and it's copied into the person you didn't really want it to be copied into? I had to think about not just the work that I did, but the way that I worked and the way that I treated other people. How did that reflect upon my faith? And I had to get used to being a church member, from the outside looking in rather than the inside looking out, not knowing why all the decisions were being made, not being part of that, not making the decisions about the future. I've had to relearn some of those things. I've had to choose to volunteer very happily with Jonathan's wife often. It meant thinking through using how the skills I learned in my day job could be used to serve more from the sidelines than from the centre. Most of all, though, it's meant that although I might not always be able to see what God's plan is clearly, I have to trust that there is one. And even when it seems he hasn't put the next step directly over my feet yet, I've got things to be getting on with doing now, to start serving him and enjoying him and what he has for me now. And as I said earlier, perhaps your experience has been very different from mine. Perhaps you had a very clear idea of what God wanted you to do and what you are doing, and you followed that path and you're certain in it and you're happy in it, and that's great. There's different experiences for different people, but perhaps it won't always be like that, and perhaps you've had that experience that things change. The career winds down, kids leave home, you have to move somewhere else, your health isn't what it used to be. What then? How will you serve God? Before I travelled to Japan during my year out before university, I was introduced to a prayer meeting that met actually just around the corner from where I live, but which I had no idea existed. When I got there, I think there was a clear 6 decades between me and the next youngest person there. Between those who couldn't hear me and those who couldn't see me, wasn't the easiest of introductions. And in many ways, at least looking from the outside, they weren't a particularly impressive group. Half a dozen of very elderly, some very frail people who met in a very average suburban front room to pray. And yet those prayers were filled with knowledge, filled with experience, filled with love, filled with vision for what God was doing half a globe away. And some of those prayers which had been prayed for decades were now being answered powerfully by God. And so it taught me that wherever you are, wherever you're serving, wherever you will serve God in the future, whatever that looks like, then there is somewhere for you to serve God and to serve God now.